All right, hello everybody. Today I have a little commentary for you on. I went back and I was in a Robert E. Howard mood, and Robert E. Howard's probably most famous character is probably Conan the Barbarian. Maybe second, and this is just kind of my opinion. I don't have any solid data behind this, but I'd say that probably his second most famous character is probably Solomon Kane. But number three is also a very interesting character because he's kind of a proto-Conan in a way, and that's Kull the Conqueror. So I went back and I decided it might be fun to go read, or I guess technically reread, because I've read this before a long time ago, but go read The Shadow Kingdom, which was the first Kull story. And it was published in 1929, August 1929, in Weird Tales. It was published in Volume 14, Number 2. Now, the thing about Robert E. Howard is that his language, his writing, is a little bit on the flowery side. There's a lot of kind of long flowing descriptions of things in general. Now, that means that it's very descriptive, and, I'm not going to take that away from him. But at the same time, it does get a little bit long sometimes, but not long enough that, I give it any minus points. Howard is actually pretty effective at knowing when to use floweriness and when to not use it. So I'd say that's pretty good. The story has good dialogue, not a huge amount of it, but a decent amount. No particularly complicated conversations, but it's a short story, so we got to take what we got. One thing I noticed on rereading this, something that jumped out at me, was that there's actually a really nice trick here. So this was the first Kull story, right? No one has ever heard of Kull the Conqueror before. That is to say, the readers have never heard of Kull the Conqueror before. And yet, Howard wanted to create a bit of a backstory, right? Now, you could do this in a variety of ways. And there's plenty of old tricks for world building, right? Like one that you've probably heard of is having a main character be kind of ignorant, right? And that way you can have people explain things to the main character, and that, allows the author to world build using the main character as kind of a stepping stone. But there was a trick here that I thought was it's not like it's a particularly, difficult trick or anything like that, but at the same time, I thought it was interesting how clear it was done. So what we have here, to fill out Kull's backstory, no one who's reading the story has ever heard of him before, right? But we want to give him some gravity. And so what we do, or what Howard did, was he added some exposition from a character not for the sake of exposition, but the purpose of this character's little monologue here was to quell Kull's suspicion by talking about his previous deeds and showing him that even though he might be expected to hold a grudge, that he does not. I'll read it to you. It begins like this. "There speaks the savage," mused Kanu. "Think you if I planned treachery I would enact it here where suspicion would be sure to fall upon me? Tut. You young tribesmen have much to learn. There were my chiefs who were not at ease because you were born among the hills of Atlantis, and you despise me in your secret mind because I am a Pict. Tush. I see you as Kull, king of Volusia, not as Kull the reckless Atlantean, leader of the raiders who harried the Western Isles. So you should see in me not a Pict, but an international man, a figure of the world. Now to that figure, hark. If you were slain tomorrow, who would be king?" So, I found this particular paragraph interesting because what it does is it establishes a history for Kull's character with a fairly well obscured, or with enough story-based stuff in the foreground that if you aren't looking for it, you might not notice that what's happening here is that Howard is like, oh yeah, here's the history of Kull, blah, right? There's something going on where there's been a tribal feud between the Atlanteans and the Picts. We hear about that a little bit earlier in the story when a diplomat comes, or a warrior diplomat comes to ask Kull to come meet with Kanu. And this stuff isn't spoiler stuff. This is super early in the story. It's worth noting that this particular world that Howard was writing, he actually was writing backstory for it that he didn't publish until much later. He wrote a short history, for instance, of this world that wouldn't be published until, I think, 1936. It was called The Hyborian Age, when it was eventually published. Howard's battle descriptions are kind of hazy and non-technical, but at the same time, it kind of fits well with the berserker quality of Kull as a character. So, to give you an example of this, swords and daggers leaped at him, and he was dimly aware that they wounded him. But Kull was in his element. Never before had he faced such grim foes, but it mattered little. They lived, their veins held blood that could be spilt, and they died when his great sword cleft their skulls or drove through their bodies. Slash, thrust, thrust, and swing. Yet had Kull died here, but for the man who crouched at his side, parrying and thrusting. For the king was clear berserk, fighting in the terrible Atlantean way that seeks death to deal death. He made no effort to avoid thrusts and slashes, standing straight up and ever plunging forward, no thought in his frenzied mind but to slay. And then there's, I'll cut there to avoid spoiling anything, but there are battle scenes, and they're actually pretty well done, especially considering the kind of character that Kull is, right? He's kind of this, he's a barbarian, he's a savage fighter. He grew up raiding the Western Hills, the Western Isles, and now he's the king of Valusia. And yet, when he gets into a fight, he kind of is taken over by this warrior rage and simply dives forward, heedless of the danger. Good language for this particular type of character. You wouldn't describe a fencing match this way, but describing this kind of battle this way is, I think, entirely appropriate. There's a great description, too, of Kull, kind of being walking wounded at one point in the story. The wild berserker blaze had passed, leaving a mazed feeling of great weariness. Blood seeped from wounds on breast, shoulder, arm, and leg. And another character, himself bleeding from a score of flesh wounds, glanced at him in some concern. Things like that. It's very visceral, so, plus points there. Another good thing about this story is that it's pretty complex for as short a story as it is. It's a little under 12,000 words, so it's definitely in short story territory. It's not even really a novelette at this point. And so we end up with enough elements that things are actually pretty interesting. We have an unlikely ally. We have multiple unlikely allies. We have an unknown truth that is revealed. We have various types of trickery, both on Kull's side and against Kull's side. We have a resolution of this trickery. We have motivation for further adventure. All of these elements are in this story, and before we get to the spoiler point, I figured I would just kind of hand wave at them, so that you can kind of see what I'm talking about. This is a lot of complexity for a 11,000 some word story. And I think it's very effective, and it does a good job of also making you want to check out later stories in the same series. One thing I will say is that the character development is a little bit scanty. Most of the development goes to Kull, which is, of course, reasonable. He's going to be the main character to be looked at, and the other characters are kind of off to the side. There's a little bit of development of the two Pictish characters that are important to the story, but really they only get developed to the point of learning whether or not they can really be trusted, and stuff like that. One other little cool thing that I found in this that made me do a little bit of research was there's an interesting phrase, and it has some magical element to it that I won't spoil, but the phrase is ka nama ka lajerama, right? And they use this phrase multiple times for a very specific reason in the story. But what it made me remember is that there was an old PC game, like an adventure game, a point-and-click adventure game called Prisoner of Ice, which uses a phrase in it, ka nama futan Cthulhu, right? And what I discovered is that ka nama does not appear in Lovecraft's work. Now, the game Prisoner of Ice is based on a Lovecraftian kind of Cthulhu storyline. But the use of ka nama in that game, along with, they say Futan Cthulhu in the game. In Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu story, it's actually Cthulhu Futang. I think it's Cthulhu Waits, something like that. And the fact that they mixed ka nama with Cthulhu Futang, it leads me to believe that this is a little bit too big of a coincidence to be a coincidence. It suggests to me that the Chaosium team that made that game was actually reading Robert E. Howard at the same time, which makes sense. Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft were friends. And so, actually there's a really, really touching, because Robert E. Howard actually passed away at a very young age, and he did so due to well, it was complicated circumstances, and you might think that Lovecraft died at an early age, but Robert E. Howard died even sooner. And so there's actually a what's the word? Shoot, like a like a like a short. I keep wanting to say epilogue, but I know that's not the right word. Lovecraft wrote a short thing about his friend Robert E. Howard after he died, and it's a nice read too. Maybe I'll put a link in the description. Anyway, with that, I think let's move to the spoiler section, and I'll tell you a little bit about this story. You can skip to the conclusion section if you don't want to have the story spoiled for you. Here we go. All right, spoiler time. So this story begins by telling us that Kull is the king of Volusia by conquest. He is a confident man. He's powerful, and he has a very martial spirit. He says early on, quote, "The army is like a sword," said Kull, "and must not be allowed to rust." So, very much a fighter, a warrior. Now, Volusia is one of the 7 ancient empires in this particular world, and it is in its decline. Kull has conquered it in order to kind of slow that decay if he can, but he's not really clear what the source of the decay is at this point. He's kind of saying, well, I'm going to, use the army, and we're going to conquer new lands, and we're going to expand our holdings, and we're going to, get that martial spirit back so we have, both power and respect kind of thing. There's some of that going on. And Kull has just returned from some expedition or adventure. And as he returns, he's requested to meet with the Pictish diplomat whose name is Khanu. Now, he's very wary of this. In fact, he was requested to visit Khanu by another Pictish guy, a warrior whose name is who he doesn't know. But what ends up happening is that Kull tries to anger him and doesn't really trust him, right? Because there's this long-term feud between Atlanteans, of which Kull is one, and the Picts, of which this diplomat and Khanu are both. And so, he kind of tries to anger this Pictish warrior who's acting as a diplomat, and uses that to kind of help him gauge whether or not he's telling the truth, or whether he's trying to trick him. And he concludes, he's probably not trying to trick me. I'll go and I'll visit Khanu as he requested. So he goes there, and they have this long conversation. The long quote that I mentioned earlier about there speaks the savage, mused Khanu. That comes from this conversation. But the real meat of the conversation is this: that Khanu says that to Kull that his life depends on following Khanu's advice. But it's not. But while it sounds kind of like a threat, it's not actually a threat. It's more of a warning. Basically, Khanu is going to send someone to go work with Kull the next night to uncover a secret that Kull is not aware of. And I think this is a great way to start the story out. You have these two people who should be feuding but are not. There's a bigger problem to deal with. You have some good development of Khanu as well, in the sense that he's kind of a almost degenerate old man. He doesn't really care about the feud between the Picts and the Atlanteans. He just is there as a diplomat, and he's trying to help Kull out. But at the same time, he's drunk. He has a bunch of serving women, that kind of stuff. Common elements in this kind of story, but well handled, I think. Now, the next night, this warrior who's going to be wearing a dragon-shaped armlet shows up, and it turns out it's actually the guy who asked Kull to go meet with Khanu in the first place. And so they don't like each other. His guy's name is Brule, B-R-U-L-E. And basically, Kull is like, oh, should I really actually follow this guy? I mean, I guess, Khanu said he's cool. And, even though I made him angry and he challenged me to a duel, and I told him I'm not going to fight an ambassador in a duel because it's against, international law effectively. I guess I'll trust him for now. And what happens is they actually go sneaking around the castle at night. And what they find, what Brule shows Kull, is that the kingdom of Volusia, its decay is for at least part of its decay is for a very specific reason. There are these serpent men, the snake men or something like that are replacing people and kind of undercutting the government, or, subverting the government to their own, evil desires. And the thing that they learn is that Kull will be replaced if he's not careful. Now, this actually is really cool because as they're sneaking around, there's a bunch of things that happen that show us that the Serpent Men are not just shapeshifters, but like quick shapeshifters. There's one of Kull's advisors that shows up, and I think it's Brule that just basically stabs him out of nowhere. And Kull's like, "What the hell are you doing?" And then as the guy falls down dead, his head reconverts to a snake, and he's like, "Oh my goodness, this guy was, actually, plotting against me." The same thing happens with Brule. Kull, they separate for a couple of minutes, and then Brule comes back, and Kull just in time to save his own life, observes that Brule is no longer wearing that dragon armlet, and so Kull dodges an attack and fights back and kills the imposter Brule as well. And then there's some more discussion on this, but it turns out, or at least it's suggested, that the Serpent Men are not just shapeshifters, which we have plenty of evidence for, but they're also soul stealers. And so if you're killed by one, you become a thrall, your soul becomes a thrall to their cause. But the cool thing about the Serpent Men, and the thing that I think is worth noting from like a literary perspective, is that they are a great source for making the narrative unreliable without making the narrator unreliable. We see books with like unreliable narrators all the time. It's a very common, trick, right? But in this, the narrator is reliable, but he's being shown things that make him think things that aren't actually true. So it adds a little extra layer of questionability to what's going on. I think that was really fun, and interesting for such a short story. The question, of course, is what's actually happening at any given time. Is this person reliable? Is this person, subverted by the Serpent Men? Is he a Serpent Man himself? Who knows? We got to find out. So they kind of sneak around the castle and they discover this Serpent Men plot going on. And basically the answer is that Kull is like, "Oh, I can't sleep. If I sleep, they'll kill me." So, he stays awake the whole night. And the next day, he's called to a meeting with, I think it's 17 councilmen. And so he takes Brule along with him, and they get there, and then all of a sudden Brule's like, "No, these guys are all Serpent Men." And so they get into this big fight. That quote from earlier was a quote, part of the quote of the fight of him versus these 17 councilmen. Now, he fights through them and he wins out, and then he finds out that not only were the councilmen deceiving him by pretending to be the councilmen, but that they also brought him not to the council room, but to this room that was supposed to be sealed. There was a previous king from ancient times who was killed, and they sealed the room that the king was in, and they were going to kill Kull and leave him there as well. So he turns the tides on them, and then they find their way back to the actual council room, and they find out that Kull has already been replaced. Now this is fun, too, because Kull has been replaced, and he's surrounded by all of his bodyguards. These guys are called the Red Slayers, and they're supposed to be very, very good. And Brule's like, "Well, clearly you've got to take care of this imposter, but you'd better go fast, because if you don't, the Red Slayers are going to stop you." And Kull's like, "I'm already pretty badly wounded. I got to do this quickly." And so he dashes in, he kills the guy. The Red Slayers are about to kill him, and he's like, "Halt!" And they're like, "Well, you guys..." The Red Slayers hesitate because they see Kull coming to attack Kull. And then the downed imposter, his head turns into a snake, and they're like, "Oh, wow, really?" And it turns out that all of the 17 councilmen are there too, and those are the human ones. And so what he does is he takes the bodies of the 17 false councilmen and the false Kull, and he brings them all to the sealed, or to the accursed room, and then he basically throws their bodies in there, closes the door, and stabs his sword in such a way that the door really can't be opened ever again. And so he's like, "Now this room is double accursed, and this is my sign that I'm going to go, take out the Serpent Men wherever they're hiding, and basically, save the world from their evil plots." So what we get is, of course, a really great hook for future stories, some good action, some interesting and tricky character bits, right? And yeah, it's just a really fun short story. It's like I said, it's under 12,000 words. It takes less than an hour to read. much less than an hour to read. And it starts out a series of stories that would be really popular back in the, late 1920s, early 1930s. And so, yeah, it's good. It keeps you reading. There's always something interesting happening. There's a few neat little narrative tricks that I mentioned in the non-spoiler section. And yeah, let's move on to the conclusion. All right, conclusion time. This was a fun story. It's written well. It has a very complex plot for as short of a book as it is. It's easily less than an hour read. It is descriptive. It brings up a lot of possibilities. It's very cool to see what Kull is planning, and the idea that, hey, after this we're going to see a bunch of stories about all the crazy adventures and stuff that he has trying to fight off these serpent men and kind of bring light back to the world in a way is, I think, really interesting. So, I'll have links in the description as to where you can read this story. I'll even put in a link to where you can find Howard's story, The Hyborian Age, which will give you a little bit of a history lesson for what Howard was going for with these stories. And they're fun reads. Other stuff that I'm working on right now, I was looking through Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature. That's the one where the video that I talked about got the inspiration to look at the Willows, right? So I was looking through that. I was, picking up random authors that are mentioned in there and reading a story or two, picking up random stories mentioned there. And one that I found interesting was a guy named Walter de la Mare. Lovecraft talks about his novel The Return, as well as shorter stories Seaton's Aunt and A Recluse. I read Seaton's Aunt, and I read a couple of other short stories, but one of them actually jumped out at me. It's not one that Lovecraft mentions, so I'm thinking I might do a little review and reading of a story called A Revenant by Walter de la Mare. It was an interesting story that I don't know, for some reason it kind of piqued my interest, we'll say. And it'll be pretty clear why that is when I actually get around to it. But it is a fairly long story, so it might take a while for me to actually do the reading. So, plus it doesn't have any chapter cuts, so it'd be hard for me to do with it what I did with The Dead Man's Tale. So I'm going to try to get it all together, but it might take me a week or two to actually find the time to do all the recording and editing. Other thing that's going on is that I had a story that I was working on. I had the idea last year, and I wrote a couple paragraphs, and I didn't really like what I was getting out of it. And so I kind of set it on ice for a little while. But then about a month ago, I started poking at this idea again and doing some brainstorming, some outlining, stuff like that. And I actually came up with some ideas that I think make it from a very simple, flash fiction short story of horror to something that might be a little bit more fun to read, and a little bit longer too. So I'm working on that. Tentative, or I guess working title, is Eyes in the Dark. That's going to be fun, I hope, once I get done with it. But who knows how long that'll take. If you're interested in seeing any of the horror stuff that I've written, most of the horror stuff I've written has had kind of a science fiction bent. This one does not. So we'll see where that goes. This one's more of a wilderness occult kind of story. But if you want to see how I handle horror, I'll put some links in the description. The two stories that are, I think I did best at was a story called Jade Cargo and another story called The Fifth. And those are both very, very short stories. They're, 20-minute reads or something like that, if that. But they're kind of science fiction horror, futuristic science fiction horror. I also wrote a novella called What the Soul Still Fears, which I'll put a link to that in the description too, which is more of a modern sci-fi horror. Not sci-fi. It's a modern occult horror with hard science as part of the story element to it. I always like throwing that in there. So I did that. I think that story is actually really good, so I'll put a link to that too. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now. We'll figure out what I'm up to for next week. Probably need to start reading Krondor the Assassins and probably do some more pulp looks and stuff like that. But that's kind of where we're at right now. Anyway, it's Friday. It's the end of the week. So I hope you have a good weekend. I hope you have some fun things to read, maybe if you get some free time. And thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you next time. as always, you know, if you like what the channel, you know what if you like what I'm doing, you know what to do. And I will see you next week when I will come up with something for you. Anyway, have a good one.